The two guards outside our bedchamber were wrong. I noticed it the way you notice a crack in a mirror, not because you were looking for damage, but because the reflection suddenly stops making sense. Their posture was different. The rotation of their shoulders when they turned. The way they held their plasma lances a fraction too high, as though the weapons were unfamiliar in their hands. I had walked past the real guards every morning and every evening for 5 months, and these men were not them. I was standing at the dining table in our quarters, pouring a second glass of Vale wine, when Cade said it. The two guards outside our quarters have been replaced by people who don't belong here. I set the glass down. My hand was steady, but only because I had been raised in a court where trembling was a confession. Cade Ashford, my husband of 5 months, sat across from me with his hands folded on the table. He looked the way he always looked, calm, patient, like a man waiting for a train he already knew was late. "How long have you known?" I asked. Since we came back from dinner, the shift change was 40 minutes early, and the replacement team did not use the correct corridor. They came from the East Wing, the duty rotation for our wing stages from the North Barracks. He paused. "I would estimate we have about 6 minutes before whoever sent them decides that the quiet approach is not working." I stared at him. 5 months. I had been married to this man for 5 months, and in all that time he had been exactly what his file said he was. A mid-level cultural liaison from the United Earth Commonwealth, selected for a political marriage that neither government particularly cared about. He was polite, he was quiet. He read books on Sindari history and asked thoughtful questions about our trade laws. He cooked meals from Earth ingredients he had brought in sealed containers, and the food was surprisingly good, and that was the most remarkable thing about him. That was what I had believed. "How do you know all of this?" I said. He stood up from the table. "I will explain everything, but right now, I need you to move away from the windows and stay behind the bed. Can you do that for me?" The way he said it was not a request and not a command. It was something in between, spoken in a tone I had never heard from him before. The voice of a man who had said similar words many times, in many places, and who had learned exactly how to make people listen without raising his voice at all. I moved behind the bed. Cade crossed the room to the small closet where he kept his personal belongings. There was almost nothing in it. A few changes of Earth clothing, a pair of worn boots, and one sealed case, matte black, about the length of his forearm. I had seen it the day he arrived. I had assumed it was a personal keepsake, maybe a family heirloom. He had never opened it in front of me. He opened it now. Inside was a blade, not a plasma weapon, not a particle cutter, not any of the energy-based armaments that every civilized species in the galaxy had adopted centuries ago. It was a physical blade, short and straight, forged from some dark metal I did not recognize. There was no ornamentation, no engraving, no decoration of any kind. It was the most functional object I had ever seen, a thing designed for a single purpose with absolute clarity. Cade drew the blade from the case, and the motion was so smooth, so rehearsed, so deeply embedded in his muscle memory that it looked like breathing. He held it at his side with the point angled slightly downward, and he turned toward the door, and he waited. "I need to tell you who I am, so you understand why none of this made sense to me. My name is Valith Sindara. I am the 7th daughter of Emperor Korath Sindara, ruler of the Sindari Empire, which spans 43 star systems and commands one of the 5 largest fleets in the known galaxy. 7th daughter means I am royal enough to be used and unimportant enough to be spent. When the United Earth Commonwealth opened trade negotiations with our empire 2 years ago, someone in the diplomatic corps suggested a cultural marriage to cement the goodwill. My father agreed. My older siblings laughed. My eldest brother, Crown Prince Rathan, told me at the farewell dinner that I was being put to excellent use. I did not choose Cade. I did not know him before the wedding. The ceremony was grand in the way that insignificant things are sometimes made grand to disguise their unimportance. 1,000 guests, none of whom cared. Music composed for the occasion, which no one would remember. My sisters stood in the ceremonial line, with expressions of practiced sympathy. Cade stood at the altar in Commonwealth formal dress, plain and dark and unadorned, and he met my eyes with the calm composure of a man who understood exactly what this arrangement was, and had accepted it without complaint. I walked through those first weeks in a fog of resentment and resignation. The palace had given us quarters in the lesser wing, far from the seat of power, a polite architectural statement about our irrelevance. Cade settled in without protest. He kept his belongings minimal. He established routines, early morning exercises on the terrace, fluid repetitive movements that I glimpsed from a window once and dismissed as some human fitness ritual. Meals he cooked himself, simple but well prepared, offered to me with the politeness of a good host rather than the warmth of a husband. Evenings spent reading, always reading, absorbing Sindari history and culture and governance with an appetite that seemed genuine. He asked me questions about the structure of the Imperial Council, about the military chain of command, about the trade routes and the treaty obligations, and the balance of power among the noble houses. I answered, because I was bored, and because the questions were intelligent, and because, beneath my resentment, I appreciated that someone was actually interested. My own family had never asked me about governance. They had never considered me relevant enough to inform. It was during this period that I noticed the small things. Cade always positioned himself between me and any doorway we passed through. When we entered a room together, his eyes moved in a specific pattern, corners first, then exits, then the center. He mapped every space he entered, quickly and completely, and he did it so naturally that it was invisible unless you were looking for it. He slept on the low couch in our quarters rather than the bed, and he slept lightly, and twice I woke in the night and found him already awake, sitting up, his eyes on the door. I had thought it was insomnia. I had thought it was discomfort, the alien environment keeping him on edge. I had assigned it to the obvious explanations, because the obvious explanations were the only ones that fit the person I believed him to be. Now the door exploded inward. Not with a blast charge. With a focused kinetic ram, the kind used by military breach teams. The frame shattered, and 6 figures poured through the opening in a tight tactical formation. 2 high, 2 low, 2 flanking. They wore dark armor, with no insignia, and they carried plasma blades and short-range kinetic pistols. Professional, coordinated, fast. Not fast enough. Cade moved before the door finished falling. He stepped forward into the breach point, directly into the space where the attackers expected empty room, and he was among them before their formation could spread. I watched from behind the bed, and what I saw in the next 90 seconds rewrote everything I understood about the man I had married. He did not fight the way Sindari warriors fight. Our soldiers are trained in broad, powerful techniques, designed for beings with greater reach and denser musculature than humans. They fight with strength and precision and overwhelming force. Cade fought with none of those things. He fought with geometry. Every movement placed him in the exact position where the most attackers were blocked by each other, where their weapons could not track him without risking their own allies, where the confined space of the doorway turned their numbers from an advantage into a trap. The first attacker swung a plasma blade in a lateral arc. Cade stepped inside the arc, past the energy edge, and drove his elbow into the attacker's throat. The man folded. Cade took his falling body and redirected it into the second attacker, tangling their legs. The third fired a kinetic pistol. Cade was already below the shot, pivoting on one knee, and his blade opened a precise line across the third attacker's weapon hand. The pistol clattered away. The fourth and fifth came together, coordinated, blades high. Cade stepped backward once, let their strikes cross each other in the space where he had been, then stepped forward between their extended arms and struck twice. Short, controlled impacts. Both men dropped. The sixth attacker hesitated, just for a heartbeat, just long enough to process what had happened to the other 5. Cade closed the distance before the hesitation ended, and put the man on the ground with a strike I could not even follow. 90 seconds, maybe less. 6 armored operatives, and Cade had dismantled them the way you might sort a disorganized shelf. Calmly, efficiently, without urgency. 2 of them were still conscious. I realized, watching from behind the bed with my hearts pounding so hard I could hear them in my ears, that this was deliberate. He had chosen which ones to leave awake. The strikes that put the others down had been calculated not just for effect, but for degree. He had measured the exact amount of force each target required, in real time, while fighting all 6 simultaneously. Cade wiped his blade on the fallen armor of the nearest attacker, sheathed it, and turned to me. His breathing was slightly elevated, slightly. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I shook my head because I could not speak. He nodded and walked to the two conscious attackers. He knelt beside the first one and spoke in a conversational tone. "You are Vethrani Accord. Your entry pattern was a modified Kessler breach, which your faction adapted from Sindari Marine Doctrine about 3 years ago. You staged from the East Service Corridor, which means you have at least one contact in the Palace maintenance staff. I need to know how many more teams are active in the building tonight. If you tell me now, I will make sure you receive medical attention before the Imperial Guard arrives. If you do not tell me, I will ask your colleague, and I will not make the same offer twice." The attacker told him. "Everything. 2 more teams, one targeting the communications array, one positioned near the lower gallery as extraction." Cade relayed this information into a small communication device I had never seen him carry, speaking in clipped Commonwealth military codes. Then he stood up and walked back to me. "The Imperial Guard will be here in approximately 4 minutes, he said. "I am sorry about the door. I will explain what I can." I finally found my voice. "Who are you?" He looked at me with those quiet brown eyes, the same eyes that had watched me across dozens of dinners, and asked me gentle questions about Sindari poetry, and he said, "My name is Cade Ashford. I was not always a diplomat." The Imperial Guard arrived 6 minutes later, not 4. Cade had been off by 2 minutes, and I would later learn that this bothered him more than the fight itself. Commander Torvan, a decorated veteran of 3 border wars who stood nearly 7 feet tall and carried enough combat citations to fill a wall, walked into our shattered quarters and took in the scene. 6 Vethrani operatives, neutralized, 2 conscious and restrained, a human with a short blade standing beside the 7th princess, who was unharmed. Torvan looked at Cade for a long moment. Cade delivered a tactical briefing, concise, precise, structured in a format that even I recognized as military. Entry vectors, timing, communication patterns, the location of the remaining teams. Torvan dispatched units to intercept. Then he looked at Cade again and said, "What unit?" Cade said, "Sentinel Corps. Retired." Torvan's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recognition. Not of the name specifically, but of the type. Warriors know warriors. It is a language that does not require translation. He nodded once and left without another word. I asked Cade what the Sentinel Corps was. He told me it was a small division within the Commonwealth military that handled situations where conventional forces were insufficient or unavailable. He said it calmly, the way you might describe a department within a large company. He told me he had served for 11 years and had been retired for 3. He told me the marriage assignment was supposed to be quiet, a genuine diplomatic posting, and that he had hoped his past would stay where he left it. "Please do not tell anyone," he said. "It will complicate things." I agreed, because I was still trying to reconcile the man who cooked me breakfast with the man who had just disabled 6 armed soldiers in the time it takes to pour a glass of water. I agreed, because I was afraid, not of him exactly, but of the vast blank space between what I thought I knew and what was clearly true. That night, after the guards were replaced with real ones, and the door was repaired, and the palace hummed with the quiet urgency of a security breach being managed, I lay in bed and could not sleep. Cade slept on his side of the room, on the low couch he had used since our wedding night, giving me the bed without discussion or complaint. He slept lightly. I knew this because I had woken several times over the past months and found him already awake, alert, watching the door. I had thought it was insomnia. Now I understood it was something else entirely. It was a man who had spent 11 years sleeping in places where closing your eyes could mean never opening them, and who had never fully convinced his body that the danger had passed. In the morning, I began searching. The Commonwealth's diplomatic database was accessible to me through my role as his spouse, but the files on the Sentinel Corps were almost non-existent. A designation, a founding date, a note that the unit reported directly to Commonwealth Joint Command with no intermediate oversight. No personnel records, no operational history, no public acknowledgement whatsoever. The unit existed in the records the way a shadow exists on a wall, defined entirely by the absence of what should have been there. But intelligence reports from other species told a different story. I accessed Sindari military intelligence archives, using my Imperial clearance, and found references scattered across dozens of classified briefings from half a dozen civilizations. The Kethrani hegemony, the Dravini Compact, the Ven Consortium. Each of them had noted the same pattern, independently, over a span of 2 decades. Small human teams, sometimes fewer than a dozen, deployed to situations that should have been impossible. Fortified positions taken in hours. Hostage rescues executed with 0 civilian casualties. Planetary sieges broken by forces that were outnumbered by ratios that made no tactical sense. The language used in these reports was careful, clinical, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Words like anomalous and disproportionate and unexplained lethality appeared with a frequency that went beyond professional caution and entered the territory of genuine unease. A Kethrani intelligence analyst had written, in a footnote to a classified assessment, that the human units in question operate at a level of tactical integration that our current models cannot account for. Recommend further study before initiating any diplomatic action that might be interpreted as hostile. Further study. The Kethrani had spent 50 years conquering 3 star systems, and their response to a 12-person human team was to recommend further study. I closed the files and looked at the sealed case sitting quietly in the closet, and I tried to understand how the galaxy had miscalculated an entire species so badly. Over the following weeks, our life continued in something like its previous pattern, but the architecture beneath it had shifted. Cade still cooked breakfast. He still read Sindari history. He still asked me about my day, with what I now recognized was not idle curiosity, but a systematic and continuous assessment of the political landscape around us. Every question he had ever asked me, I realized, had served a dual purpose. He was learning our culture because he genuinely cared about understanding it, and he was mapping the threats in our environment with the patience and precision of a man who had done this so many times it had become invisible. I began watching him in return. The early morning exercises I had glimpsed from the window took on new meaning. The fluid, repetitive movements were combat forms, stripped of all decoration, refined to pure efficiency. Each motion flowed into the next, with a continuity that suggested not practice, but conversation, as though his body was speaking a language it had known since long before I met him. He positioned himself between me and every doorway we walked through. He mapped exits in every room within seconds of entering. He tracked the movements of servants, guards, and courtiers with a passive awareness that never seemed to engage his conscious attention, but never missed anything. He had been protecting me since the day he arrived. I just had never noticed because he made it look like nothing. And slowly, carefully, like 2 people learning a language neither of them was born to, we began to talk. Not about politics or duty or the transaction that had brought us together, but about real things. He told me about Earth. Rain, he said, was something you could hear before it arrived, a sound on the wind that meant the sky was about to open. Music was mathematics made emotional. Autumn was a season where the trees set themselves on fire in slow motion, gold and red and amber, and humans found it beautiful rather than alarming. He described oceans, vast bodies of water so large that you could not see the other side. And I asked him what it felt like to stand at the edge of something that big, and he said it felt like humility. I told him about the crystal gardens of my homeworld, where minerals grew in formations that sang when the wind passed through them. I told him about the songs my mother taught me, lullabies in a language so old that even we had forgotten some of the words. I told him that I had expected this marriage to be a cage and had found instead that it was simply a room with a stranger in it, and that the stranger was becoming less strange every day. He listened the way he did everything, completely. It was during one of these conversations that he told me something that stayed with me. I had asked him why he carried a physical blade instead of an energy weapon. He said that where he came from, a blade was a promise. You carried it close. You maintained it yourself. And when you drew it, you were saying something that could not be unsaid. A blade meant you were present. It meant the fight was personal. It meant you had chosen to stand in the space between someone you cared about and whatever was trying to reach them, and you would not move. I looked at him then, at this quiet, unremarkable man who read books and cooked meals, and carried inside him a capacity for violence that had frightened the intelligence agencies of 6 civilizations. and I thought that I was only beginning to understand what I had married. But I was not the only one who had taken notice. The failed assassination attempt had sent ripples through the palace. Servants talked, guards talked. The story of the human who had defeated 6 Vethrani operatives with a short blade in 90 seconds spread through the court like heat through metal, distorted and amplified with each retelling. 3 days after the attack, a summons arrived from Crown Prince Rethranan. He wanted to meet the human. He wanted Cade brought to a formal court dinner, presented before the senior military council, the noble houses, and a gallery of foreign ambassadors. The summons was polite, the intent was not. Rethan collected people the way some collect weapons, to understand their mechanisms and determine whether they were useful or dangerous. He had heard about the attack, he had heard about the 6 operatives, and now he wanted to see the human up close. I told Cade we could decline. He shook his head. If we refuse, he will find another way, and we will not control the terms. Better to walk in than to be dragged. I dressed in formal court attire, the layered silks and crystalline pins of the Sindari imperial line, and Cade wore the dark formal suit of a Commonwealth diplomat. Simple, clean, no medals, no insignia, no decoration. We walked into the great hall together, and every eye in the room found us before we reached the bottom of the stairs. The hall was magnificent, and it was designed to make you feel small. Vaulted ceilings inlaid with luminescent mineral patterns that shifted color with the ambient temperature. Floating light arrays that tracked the movements of the most important guests, leaving others in calculated shadow. Tiered seating that placed the crown prince above everyone, looking down. Rethan sat at the high table with his inner circle, his personal champion standing behind his chair like a monument carved from stone. Draven Cole, 7 feet of Sindari muscle and combat training, decorated in over 40 formal duels, undefeated in every single one. He carried the ceremonial polearm of the Imperial Champion, a weapon as much a symbol of status as a tool of warfare. And he was watching Cade, the way a predator watches something it does not yet recognize. The dinner was an exercise in humiliation wrapped in courtesy. Rethan asked Cade about human customs, human food, human entertainment. Each question delivered with a smile that carried the unmistakable subtext that these things were quaint and amusing. He asked about human physical capabilities with the patronizing interest of a biologist discussing a lesser specimen. He asked whether humans had any traditions of martial excellence, any warrior heritage worth noting, any contribution to the galaxy's long history of conflict that might be considered significant. The courtiers laughed on cue. The ambassadors watched with diplomatic blankness. I could feel my pulse in my temples. Cade answered every question with patience and precision, giving nothing away, rising to nothing. He spoke about human history as though it were the most natural subject in the world. He mentioned the samurai, the Spartans, the Gurkhas. He spoke of warriors who fought not for glory but for principle, and he did it without boasting, without challenging, without any of the posturing that would have given Rethyon the reaction he wanted. The Crown Prince's frustration grew beneath his polished surface. He had expected the human to be either cowed or provoked, and Cade was neither. So Rethyon escalated. "I understand," the Crown Prince said, leaning forward with the easy confidence of a man who had never been refused, "that our guest demonstrated some interesting abilities during the recent unpleasantness. I think the court would enjoy a demonstration. Draven, would you be willing to spar with the human? A friendly exercise, nothing more." The court murmured with anticipation. This was what they had come for. The alien pet, put in its place by a real warrior. I opened my mouth to object, but Cade's hand touched my arm under the table. Brief. Light. A message. He stood up and bowed to Rethan. "I would be honored," he said. "I ask only that I be permitted to use my own weapon." Rethan smiled. Of course. The sparring floor was cleared. Servants moved with practiced speed, opening the wide ceremonial space at the center of the hall. The tiered seating angled inward, giving every spectator a clear view. The lighting shifted, focusing on the floor, casting the surrounding galleries into theatrical shadow. Draven Cole descended from the high table and took his position at the center of the floor. He carried the traditional Sindari dueling polearm, a weapon taller than most humans, its shaft reinforced with bonded alloy, and its blade edges laced with focused energy fields that could cut through starship plating. He rolled his massive shoulders and spun the weapon once, in a display of casual mastery, and the crowd applauded. Cade walked to the center of the floor carrying his black blade. It looked like a toy beside the polearm. The size difference between the two fighters was almost comical. Draven outweighed him by at least 100 pounds, and towered over him by more than a foot. Every physical metric favored the Sindari champion by an absurd margin. Reach, mass, raw strength, and a weapon designed to exploit all three. The court expected it to last seconds. I did not breathe. The signal was given. Draven attacked immediately, opening with a sweeping overhead strike that would have split a ground transport in half. The polearm came down with a sound like tearing air. Cade was not there. He had moved sideways, a small precise step, and the polearm carved the empty space where he had been standing. The floor cracked under the impact. Draven recovered and struck again, a lateral sweep at chest height that forced the air to whistle. Cade ducked it by exactly the margin required, no more, and the energy-laced edge passed over his head close enough to stir his hair. A third strike, a thrusting combination that demonstrated why Draven had won 40 duels. The polearm became a blur, striking from 3 angles in rapid succession, each attack flowing into the next with the precision of decades of training. Cade avoided all 3. He did not block, he did not parry. He simply occupied the precise point in space where the weapon was not, and he did it with such minimal movement that it almost looked like Draven was missing on purpose. 3 full offensive sequences, and Cade had not attempted a single counter. He had simply not been where the blows landed. The court had gone quiet, not the anticipatory silence of an audience waiting for the finish, but the uncomfortable silence of people watching something they do not understand. Then Cade moved. It was a single continuous motion, so fluid that it looked choreographed, except that choreography implies planning, and what Cade did had the quality of water finding its level. He stepped inside Draven's guard during the recovery phase of a wide lateral strike, when the polearm's momentum was committed and its arc was extended. He trapped the polearm's shaft between his blade and his forearm, twisted his body to redirect the weapon's momentum downward, using Draven's own force against him, and pinned the blade to the floor with his boot. In the same motion, his sword came up and stopped with its tip resting against Draven Kull's throat, just below the jaw, steady as stone. The entire exchange, from first step to final position, took 11 seconds. Total silence in the hall. 2,000 of the most powerful people in the Sindari Empire, and not one of them made a sound. Cade held the position for a single breath, then stepped back and sheathed his blade. He bowed to Draven first, low and respectful, with the deference of one fighter acknowledging another's skill. Then he turned and bowed to Rethon. No smile, no flourish, no triumph in his eyes, no display of any kind. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, waiting, as though what had just happened was unremarkable. Draven Kull stood very still for a long moment. His polearm lay on the floor at his feet. The greatest warrior in the Sindari Empire had been disarmed and pinned in 11 seconds by a creature half his size, carrying a blade that belonged in a museum. He could have been angry. He could have been humiliated. Instead, slowly, deliberately, he extended his forearm and clasped Cade's arm in the Sindari warrior's salute, the gesture reserved for an opponent who has earned genuine respect. The sound of his armored fist closing around Cade's forearm echoed in the silent hall. Cade returned the clasp. For a moment, the two of them stood there, connected, and the hall held its breath. Then Draven released him and stepped back, and the spell broke, and the room erupted in noise. Not applause exactly, something more complex. The sound of 2,000 people simultaneously revising their understanding of the world. Rethon's expression had changed. The amusement was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. The human was no longer a curiosity. The human was a variable. I watched his eyes track Cade as we returned to our seats, and I saw the gears turning behind them. The rapid reassessment of threat and opportunity that was my brother's most dangerous talent. I watched the ambassadors' hands moving beneath their tables, entering messages on concealed devices. Before the dinner ended, intelligence agencies across the galaxy would have reports on what had happened in this room. The quiet human from the minor species had just dismantled the Crown Prince's undefeated champion in front of the most powerful people in the Sindari Empire, and he had done it as casually as opening a door. We returned to our quarters in silence. The palace corridors felt different now, charged with the energy of something that could not be taken back. When our door closed behind us, I turned to Cade. "You have made yourself visible," I said. "The court will not forget what they saw tonight." "I know." "Then why did you accept?" He sat on the edge of the low couch and removed his formal jacket with the unhurried calm of a man returning from a routine errand. There was no tension in his movements, no adrenaline come-down. He had just fought the most dangerous warrior in the Empire, and he was folding his jacket. "Because Rethyon was going to test me regardless," he said. "An arranged accident, a provocation, a situation where I would be forced to react without choosing the ground. This way, I controlled the terms. Draven is a warrior with integrity. He fought clean, and he will speak honestly about what happened. If Rethyon had chosen the circumstances, the test would not have been so fair, and the outcome would not have been so clear. You planned this. I prepared for the possibility. There is a difference." I sat across from him and studied his face. The same calm features, the same steady eyes. But I could no longer see them without seeing the other thing, the motion, the precision, the speed that should not have been possible from a body that size. The two images refused to merge. The man who asked me about my childhood and the man who had just put a blade to the throat of a champion. They existed in the same body, and I could not make them into one person. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me what you were, not the official answer, the real one." He was quiet for a while. Then he told me about Operation Ashfall, a refueling station in contested space. Designation, Outpost Heron. 60,000 civilians aboard. Mining families, supply workers, medical staff, children attending the station's small school. A hostile fleet, the Calyx Dominion, had surrounded the station. They intended to take it as a strategic choke point and did not care how many civilians died in the process. Commonwealth forces were 4 days away. The Sentinel Corps was not. 12 operatives inserted through a maintenance port during a scheduled supply delivery. They fortified the station's internal choke points, disabled the docking clamps to prevent boarding, rerouted the station's environmental systems to create pressure differentials in the corridors that would slow armored assault teams. They did all of this in 6 hours, working in silence, while 60,000 people slept. Then the Dominion breached. 3 days, 12 people against 900 enemy combatants who came through every access point the station had. The corridors became a maze of controlled engagements, each one designed to channel the attackers into kill zones where the Sentinels' smaller numbers were irrelevant. They fought in shifts. They slept in 30-minute rotations. They burned through medical supplies and ammunition, and every reserve of human endurance. And they held. 4 of us walked out, Cade said. He said it the same way he had described the weather in autumn. A fact. Something that had happened. A stone that had been worn smooth by the river of repetition. I asked him what happened to the other 8. He told me their names. Every one. He told me where each of them fell and what they were doing when it happened. He told me that one of them, a woman named Grace Holloway, held a corridor by herself for 6 hours, while the rest of them sealed a reactor breach that would have killed everyone on the station. She was 29 years old. She played the violin. She had a dog named Pepper that she talked about constantly, and she had made Cade promise to take care of him if anything happened. Cade had kept that promise. Pepper lived with his sister now. He did not cry. He did not shake. He sat there with his hands on his knees and recited the details of the worst 3 days of his life, with the practiced steadiness of someone who had told this story to himself so many times that it had worn smooth. The edges rounded, the sharp parts filed down to something he could hold without bleeding. I understood then that I was not afraid of Cade Ashford. I was afraid of what the galaxy had failed to understand about the species that created him. Not the violence, the endurance, the willingness to suffer, to break, to lose everything, and still keep fighting, because someone behind them needed protecting. That was not training. That was not engineering. That was something else entirely, something that came from a place so deep in the human species that they themselves could not fully explain it. The days that followed were heavy with politics. The Vethrani Accord, the separatist faction that had sent the assassins to our quarters, was accelerating its operations across the outer territories. Intelligence reports crossed my desk with increasing frequency, each one more alarming than the last. The Accord had secured off-world mercenary support from the Calyx Remnant, professional military contractors with heavy equipment and orbital strike capability. They were not simply agitating for independence anymore. They were preparing for war. And the target was not the outer territories. It was the capital itself. The Ascension Rites, the sacred ceremony held every imperial generation where the emperor formally named his successor, were 3 weeks away. Every member of the royal family, every senior military commander, every foreign dignitary of consequence, would be gathered in one place. It was the single greatest vulnerability the Empire would ever present, and the Vethrani knew it. I brought this intelligence to Rethon. I went to him in good faith, because whatever I thought of my brother personally, he was the crown prince, and this was a threat to the Empire itself. I laid out the evidence: mercenary contracts, weapons shipments, communication intercepts, a pattern that pointed, with increasing clarity, to an attack timed to the rights. He dismissed it. Not overtly. He thanked me for my diligence, complimented my thoroughness, and told me that Imperial security was well aware of the situation and had everything under control. He smiled the way he smiled when he wanted you to believe him, with warmth that reached his mouth but not his eyes. And in those eyes, the calculation I had seen at the dinner was still there, cold and patient and waiting. When I left his chambers, I felt the particular kind of coldness that comes from realizing that the person you asked for help is the person you need help against. Rethon did not want to stop the attack. He wanted to use it. The chaos, the disruption, the fog of crisis, those were not threats to his ambitions. They were tools. I told Cade. He listened without interrupting, sitting in his chair with his hands folded, processing what I said with the same systematic attention he brought to everything. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes. "Then we prepare for both threats," he said. "The one outside the walls and the one inside." "How?" "Carefully." He contacted his Commonwealth colleagues in the diplomatic mission. I had believed the mission consisted of 4 diplomats and a small administrative staff. I learned now that 3 of the administrative staff were Sentinel Corps, either active or reserve. They had been embedded in the mission since its inception, a standard practice, Cade said, for any Commonwealth posting in politically unstable territory. Their names were Dylan Mercer, Patricia Hale, and Liam Crawford. They arrived at our quarters within an hour of Cade's message, and I watched the dynamic carefully. They did not salute. There was no formal protocol, no clicking of heels, no stiff military deference. What happened was subtler and more revealing. They entered the room and oriented themselves around Cade, the way planets orient around a star, naturally, instinctively, without thought. Dylan, a stocky man with copper hair and a jaw that looked like it had been broken and reset more than once, took the position nearest the window. Patricia, a lean woman with dark skin and watchful eyes that never stopped moving, stood by the door. Liam, tall and freckled and disarmingly friendly-looking, dropped into a chair across from Cade and waited. They had not been told where to stand. They simply knew. These people did not just serve with Cade. They had followed him into places they should not have survived, and the fact that they had survived had bound them to him with something stronger than rank. Cade began preparing, not just himself and his team, but me. He trained me every morning in the hour before the palace woke. Not to fight like him, that was not possible, and he did not pretend otherwise. He trained me to survive, how to read a room for threats, how to identify exits within 3 seconds of entering any space, how to move through a crowd during a crisis, low and fast and angled toward hard cover, how to control my breathing when my body wanted to panic, how to fall without injury, how to keep moving when everything inside me screamed to freeze. "Fear is not the problem," he told me during one of these sessions, watching me run through a movement drill in the pre-dawn light. "Fear is information. It tells you something in your environment has changed and requires attention. The problem is when fear makes you stop moving. Whatever happens, keep your feet. Whatever you hear, keep going, do not stop." I practiced until the movements felt less like performance and more like instinct. I practiced until I could map a room's exits while holding a conversation with a courtier. I practiced until the part of my brain that wanted to freeze when startled learned to activate instead of shut down. And I watched Cade prepare in his own way. He walked every corridor of the palace, memorizing sightlines and timing gaps and structural vulnerabilities. He studied the ceremonial schedule for the ascension rites, identifying the moments of maximum vulnerability, the transitions between events when crowds would be densest and guard rotations would be in flux. He mapped the overlapping jurisdictions of the different guard units, the points where one unit's responsibility ended and another's began, because those gaps were where attackers would strike. He shared his assessment with Commander Torvan, and this time, the old warrior listened without pride. Whatever Torvan had thought of humans before, the night of the assassination attempt and the spectacle of the duel had rearranged his thinking. He asked Cade questions that were pointed and professional, and Cade answered them the same way, and watching the two of them work together was like watching two instruments tuned to the same frequency. One evening, after a long session of planning, I found a file I had not previously been cleared to access. My new status as a member of the Imperial Security Consultation, a role Torvan had granted me after the assassination attempt, had expanded my clearance, and I used it to dig deeper into Commonwealth military records. Most of Cade's dossier was redacted, black lines over black lines, pages of carefully removed information that formed a silhouette of something enormous. But at the bottom of the final assessment page, someone had written a single note in the margins. A handwritten observation, probably from a commanding officer, that had escaped the redaction process. Recommend against deployment in politically sensitive theaters. Subject's combat capability is not the concern. The concern is that opposing forces, upon encountering the subject, tend to stop functioning as organized military units. I read the line 3 times. I thought about Draven Cole, the greatest warrior in the Sindari Empire, standing still on the sparring floor with a blade at his throat. I thought about the 6 Vethrani operatives scattered across our bedroom floor. I thought about the Kethrani intelligence report that recommended further study. Then I closed the file and looked across the room at Cade, who was sitting quietly in a chair, reading a book on Sindari ceremonial architecture, making notes in the margins with a pencil. His feet were bare. There was a cup of tea cooling beside him. The ascension rites began on a morning that felt too beautiful for what was coming. The capital blazed with light. Millions of citizens filled the processional boulevards. Delegations from 30 allied systems arrived in gleaming diplomatic vessels. The military assembled in ceremonial formation, banners and armor polished until they burned in the sun. It was the most important political event in the Sindari Empire's calendar, a ceremony that occurred once in a generation, and it drew power the way a star draws matter, pulling everything into its orbit. The first day passed without incident. Ceremonial processions, ritual declarations, formal reception of the foreign delegations. My father, Emperor Korath, presided from the crystal throne, diminished by age but still commanding in the way that old trees are commanding, rooted deep, unbowed by weather. The question of succession hung over everything like a scent in the air. Rethon stood at the Emperor's right hand, projecting confidence and control. My other siblings occupied their assigned positions with varying degrees of ambition and anxiety. Cade attended as my spouse, wearing Commonwealth formal dress, drawing glances and whispered comments but no direct confrontation. He was mapping the room. I could see it in his eyes, the constant micro-movements, scanning, cataloging, calculating. He squeezed my hand once during the opening ceremony, and I felt the calluses on his palm that diplomats do not have. That evening, in our quarters, he told me it would happen on day 2. The central ceremony, the naming rite, when the emperor would formally declare his successor. Maximum dignitaries, maximum symbolic value, maximum chaos if disrupted. How certain are you? I asked. Certain enough to not sleep tonight. He did not sleep. I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the speed of those 6 attackers falling, and I imagined it multiplied by hundreds. Day 2 dawned gray. A weather system had rolled in from the eastern ranges, layering the capital in low cloud that turned the crystal spires into ghostly pillars. The ceremonial hall was a vast enclosed amphitheater at the center of the palace complex, designed to hold 10,000, and it was full. Every seat occupied, every gallery packed. Dignitaries from across the empire and beyond, pressed together in their finest clothes, filling the air with the hum of quiet conversation and the rustle of ceremonial fabric. The crystal throne blazed at the center of the raised stage, and my father sat upon it in the ancient ceremonial armor of the Sindari line, looking small inside its weight, but holding himself with the rigidity of a man who refused to show weakness at the final hour. The naming rite began with prayers, then the recitation of the imperial lineage, 40 generations of Sindari rulers, their names rolling through the amphitheater like distant thunder. Then the formal presentation of the candidates for succession. Rethyon stepped forward first, as was his right as eldest. He knelt before our father and received the traditional blessing, and his face was composed and reverent, and his eyes were calculating. Then the world came apart. The first explosions hit the outer perimeter walls. 3 simultaneous detonations, shaped charges placed in the utility tunnels beneath the processional boulevard. The amphitheater shook. Dust rained from the vaulted ceiling. The lights flickered and stabilized. Before the crowd could process what was happening, a second wave of blasts targeted the communications array on the roof of the palace, severing broadcast capability and jamming military frequencies across every band. The capital went silent. Then the ground-level assault began. Vethrani Accord forces, reinforced by off-world mercenaries in heavy tactical armor, breached the perimeter at 7 points simultaneously. They moved with the precision of a long-planned operation, executing on schedule, advancing through the outer corridors in coordinated fire teams, while heavy weapons teams laid down suppressive fire on the guard positions along the walls. Inside the amphitheater, 10,000 people tried to move at once. The sound was immense, a wall of voices and screams, and the deep structural vibration of explosions growing closer. The Imperial Guard mobilized, but they were fragmenting under simultaneous pressure at too many breach points, unable to coordinate without communications, unable to determine which threats were feints and which were genuine assaults. And in the chaos, Rethyon made his move. I saw it happen. I was watching for it, because Cade had told me to watch, and even so, it was almost too smooth to catch. His loyalist guards, 40 of them, shifted position with coordinated precision. They were not responding to the external attack. They were executing a separate plan entirely, a plan within a plan, designed to use the Vethrani assault as cover. 20 of them secured the corridors leading to the Emperor's personal chambers. 20 more sealed the stage exits, trapping the Emperor on the raised platform. Rethyon rose from his kneeling position, turned to the assembled court, and declared emergency succession authority under the Imperial Crisis Protocols, a legal mechanism that allowed the Crown Prince to assume temporary command if the Emperor was incapacitated or endangered. My father was not incapacitated. He was sitting on his throne, fully conscious, fully aware, watching his eldest son steal his empire in real time. I could see his face from across the amphitheater. It held no surprise, only a deep and terrible sadness. Rethon's voice carried across the hall, amplified by the stage's acoustic design. The Emperor is hereby placed under protective custody for his safety. All military authority transfers to the Crown until the crisis is resolved. All guard units will report to my command, effective immediately. It was a coup. Dressed in legalese and wrapped in an emergency, but a coup. And the people in the amphitheater, trapped between an external attack and an internal power grab, could do nothing but watch. Cade was already moving. "Dylan, Patricia, with me," he said, and the words were not loud, but they cut through the noise with the authority of a man who had commanded in worse situations than this. "Liam, stay with the princess. Valeth, you need to reach the secondary communications array in the sublevel. Can you find it?" "Yes," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected, because he had trained me for this. Not for this specific scenario, but for the feeling, the fear, the urge to freeze. He had taught me to move through it, and my body responded before my mind could interfere. "Good. Restore broadcast capability. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, do not stop moving. What are you going to do?" He looked at me, and for a moment the calm surface cracked, and underneath it, I saw something that was not strategy, and not violence. It was the look of a man who had found something worth protecting after years of believing he had nothing left to fight for. "I am going to reach your father," he said. Then he drew his blade, and Dylan and Patricia flanked him, and the three of them moved into the panicked crowd like a current, cutting through choppy water. People parted around them without understanding why, responding to something primal in their movement, some ancient recognition of predators in motion. Liam Crawford stayed with me. He was a tall man, with freckled skin and calm gray eyes, and he carried no visible weapon, but I had stopped believing that meant anything when it came to humans. "Ready, Your Highness?" he said. His tone was conversational, easy, as though we were heading to lunch rather than running through a palace under siege. Ready. We moved, through the side gallery, down a service corridor, against the flow of panicked civilians and running guards. The air was thick with dust, and the acrid smell of detonation residue. Emergency lighting cast everything in sharp red tones. Twice, Vethrani fighters appeared in our path, dark-armored figures moving through the lower corridors to secure the palace's infrastructure. Twice, Liam dealt with them so quickly that I barely had time to register the threat before it was over. He fought the same way Cade did, that same terrifying economy, that same sense that violence was not something he sought or enjoyed, but simply a tool he deployed with clinical precision when no alternative existed. We reached the secondary communications array in the sublevel. It was an older system, backup technology installed decades ago, and largely forgotten, maintained more out of bureaucratic inertia than any expectation of use. Liam cleared the room in 3 seconds, checking every angle and shadow before signaling me forward. I sat at the console and my hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. Cade had trained me to separate the two. Fear in the body, function in the brain. The jamming signal was broad spectrum, designed to blanket every modern communication frequency. But the secondary array operated on a frequency range that predated modern jamming technology by 2 generations. It was like trying to dam a river while ignoring the old riverbed that ran underneath it. I found the gap. I opened the channel, and I broadcast. I broadcast everything. The Vethrani assault, the breach points, the mercenary reinforcements, and Rethon's coup, his exact words, his guards sealing the Emperor's chambers, his invocation of emergency succession. I broadcast it on the Imperial military frequency, the diplomatic band, and the civilian emergency channel. I sent it to the fleet in orbit, to the planetary defense grid, to every ship and station and outpost that could receive a signal. The Empire heard me, the 7th daughter, the expendable princess, the one they had married off to a human and forgotten about. They heard me, and the calculus of the entire crisis changed. While I was restoring communications, Cade was cutting his way through the palace. I learned what happened later, from Commander Torvan, from security recordings, from the accounts of guards who witnessed it and spoke about it afterward, in the hushed tones that people reserve for things that make them reconsider what they believe is possible. Cade and his 2 operatives moved toward the Emperor's chambers, through corridors that had become a 3-dimensional battlefield. Vethrani assault teams pressed inward from the breached perimeter. Rethranan's loyalist guards held their positions along the route to the Emperor. Confused Imperial Guard units were caught between 2 enemies they could not distinguish from each other, firing at shadows, taking cover from allies, the entire defensive structure of the palace, fragmenting under the pressure of simultaneous betrayal from within and assault from without. Cade navigated all of it. He read the tactical insignia, the movement patterns, the coordination signals, and he identified which fighters served the Accord and which served the Crown Prince within seconds. He engaged both without hesitation and without confusion, moving through a 3-sided conflict as though it were a problem he had already solved and was simply executing the answer he had prepared hours ago. Dylan and Patricia moved with him in a formation that witnesses described as a single entity with 6 arms. They covered angles, cleared corners, and neutralized threats in a continuous flowing sequence that never paused, never stuttered, never wasted a step. They communicated in gestures and glances, a language built not in training manuals, but in shared experience, in corridors like these, in situations like this, in the furnace of operations that had burned away everything unnecessary and left only trust. They reached the corridor leading to the Emperor's chambers. 20 of Rethan's elite guards held the passage, the Crown Prince's hand-picked veterans, the best warriors in his personal army. They were armed with the finest weapons in the Empire, and armored in bonded plating that could shrug off standard plasma fire. They had been positioned here specifically because Rethion expected resistance, and he wanted the finest wall money could buy between the throne and anyone who might challenge his claim. The fight lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a very long time in close combat, and the fact that it lasted that long is a testament to the quality of Rethion's guard, but it was never in doubt. Cade did what the Commonwealth dossier had described. He did not simply defeat them, he disassembled their cohesion. The guards' coordination depended on communication, on shared awareness, on the confidence that comes from knowing your flanking partner is holding their position and your squad leader has a plan. Cade destroyed all 3 pillars simultaneously. He struck at the seams between individual guards, targeting the moments when one fighter was relying on another's coverage, creating cascading gaps that turned their tight formation into a series of isolated encounters. Dylan and Patricia exploited every gap he created, widening the fractures, forcing the guards to make impossible choices between covering their own positions and supporting their failing neighbors. Their confidence broke. That was the critical moment. Not the physical defeat, which was inevitable once the formation failed, but the psychological collapse that preceded it. Rethion's guards were elite warriors, professionals who had trained their entire lives, and they found themselves unable to predict, unable to coordinate, unable to function as the unit they had always been. One by one, the last 6 standing lowered their weapons and stepped aside. Not because they were injured, not because they were exhausted, because they had recognized, in the way that warriors recognize such things, that they were facing something they could not overcome by adding more bodies to the line. Cade reached the Emperor's chamber. The door was sealed from within. Dylan breached it in 4 seconds. Inside, Rethon stood before our father with a document of emergency succession, demanding a signature. 2 personal attendants flanked him, ceremonial guards who posed no real threat but carried the symbolic weight of the Crown Prince's authority. When the door opened and Cade stepped through with his blade drawn and his 2 operatives behind him, Rethion's face underwent a transformation that I wish I could have seen. The security recording showed it clearly. The arrogance crumbled. The calculation failed. The carefully maintained mask of control fell away, and what was left was the face of a man confronting a variable he had never accounted for. "Your Majesty," Cade said, addressing my father with a bow that never took his eyes off Rethion. "The Princess Valith has restored communications. The Imperial fleet has received her broadcast. Your forces are aware of the situation in full." Rethon tried to salvage it. He was eloquent and persuasive, and increasingly desperate, speaking of crisis protocols and protective necessity, of the duties of succession and the weight of leadership. He painted a picture of a loyal son acting to preserve his father's legacy in a moment of unprecedented danger. But the broadcast was running, the entire empire was listening, and the picture Rethon painted could not survive contact with the reality that the 7th princess had already described. My father looked at Cade for a long time, then he looked at his eldest son. Then he said, in a voice that was quiet and heavy and final, "Commander Torvan, please escort the Crown Prince to the secured wing." The Vethrani assault collapsed over the next 3 hours. Without the internal chaos of a succession crisis to multiply their impact, they were an external military force, attacking a fortified capital with a full Imperial fleet in orbit and a planetary defense grid coming back online. The fleet responded to my broadcast within minutes, deploying atmospheric gunships and orbital interdiction platforms that sealed the breach points with overwhelming precision. The mercenary contractors, recognizing the shift in odds, began withdrawing before the ground forces even reached them. The Vethrani Accord fighters, abandoned by their paid allies and cut off from their covert royal backer, surrendered in pockets throughout the outer palace. I found Cade afterward. He was sitting in a corridor outside the Emperor's chambers, his back against the marble wall, his blade across his knees. There was blood on his sleeve from 3 separate wounds he had not mentioned to anyone. Dylan was treating a cut above his own eye with field supplies from a kit that looked like it had seen decades of use. Patricia stood at the corridor junction, monitoring approaches with the tireless vigilance that seemed to be standard equipment for anyone who had served with Cade. I sat down beside him on the cold marble floor. The corridor smelled like smoke and ozone, and the sharp metallic tang of overheated weapons. "I am sorry," he said. "I know this is not what you signed up for." I looked at him. At the blood on his sleeve, and the exhaustion in his eyes, and the blade across his knees that he had carried across the stars, that he had hoped never to draw again, that he had drawn without a second of hesitation when the time came. "Neither is anything else that has happened," I said, "but you are the only part I would keep." He looked at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, Cade Ashford smiled. Not the diplomatic smile he wore at court functions. A real one. Small and tired, and human, and unreserved. The days that followed were a blur of politics and reconstruction, and the slow, painful process of an empire reckoning with its own fractures. Raytheon was stripped of his succession rights, and confined to the secured wing under permanent guard. The Vethrani Accord collapsed without its covert royal backing, its leaders arrested or scattered across the outer territories, its mercenary allies abandoning contracts that no longer had an employer. The palace was repaired. The dead were honored. The machinery of governance, shaken but not broken, began turning again with the grinding determination of institutions that have survived worse. I found myself at the center of something I had never anticipated, and certainly never sought. The broadcast had changed everything. The Empire had watched me break through the jamming, rally the fleet, and expose the coup in real time. My voice had been the one that cut through the chaos. My words had been the ones that named the betrayal. Ambassadors who had ignored me for years requested formal meetings. Military commanders who had never learned my name sent official acknowledgments of my service. My surviving siblings, the ones who had remained loyal, looked at me with an expression I had never seen directed at the seventh daughter before. It was not admiration exactly, it was reassessment. The sudden, uncomfortable awareness that someone you had dismissed your entire life had proven capable of something you had not. My father summoned Cade to a private audience 3 days after the crisis. I stood beside my husband in the Emperor's personal study, a small room lined with books and star maps, intimate in a way that the grand throne room could never be. My father sat in a plain chair by the window, stripped of his ceremonial armor, looking old in a way that the armor had hidden. The rites and the betrayal had taken something from him. Not his mind, which remained sharp, but the last reserves of the energy that had sustained him through 60 years of rule. He looked like a man who had been strong for so long that he had forgotten how to do anything else, and was now discovering the exhaustion that had been waiting behind the strength all along. He studied Cade for a long time. Cade stood at ease, his hands clasped behind his back, his blade absent. He had put it back in its case that morning, sealed it, returned it to the closet, next to his worn boots and his earth clothing. "Did you come here to conquer us?" my father asked. The question was not hostile. It was genuine. A ruler who had watched a single human dismantle the best warriors in his empire wanted to know if this was the opening move of something larger. If the quiet man standing before him was the tip of a spear that was still in motion. Cade met my father's eyes. "No, Your Majesty. I came here because your daughter deserved someone who would stand between her and whatever came through the door. That is all I have ever done, for anyone." My father considered this. He was a man who had navigated alliances and betrayals and wars for 6 decades, who had learned to read the truth in a person's voice the way a navigator reads the stars. Whatever he found in Cade's answer, it satisfied him. He nodded once, slowly, and said, "Then I am grateful she was given to someone worthy of her." I did not correct him. He had the right spirit of the thing, even if the direction was slightly wrong. Cade was not worthy of me, and I was not worthy of him. We were worthy of each other, which was something different and something better, and that distinction mattered. In the weeks that followed, I used my new clearance level to access the full, unredacted Commonwealth military file on Cade Ashford. I told him I was going to do it, and he did not object. He said only that some of it was difficult to read, and that he would answer any questions I had afterward. He was right. It was difficult. 14 campaigns across 8 star systems. Not battles, not engagements, not operations. Campaigns. Extended deployments in environments that ranged from orbital stations to jungle worlds to the frozen moons of gas giants, each one lasting weeks or months, each one placing a handful of people against forces that should have overwhelmed them 100 times over. The entries were clinical in their language and devastating in their content. Populations evacuated under fire. Fortifications held against impossible numbers. Insertions behind enemy lines with no extraction plan, because the mission timeline did not allow for the time one would take. I read about worlds I had never heard of, and people I would never meet, and I learned that Cade Ashford had been present at moments in human history that most humans themselves did not know about. Because that was the nature of the Sentinel Corps. They operated in the spaces between official records, in the margins of conflicts that were too sensitive or too dangerous for conventional forces, and when they succeeded, the success was attributed to someone else, and when they failed, the failure was buried. They did not fail often, but when they did, the cost was absolute. At the end of the file, the final entry, Operation Quiet Sun, a colony world called Meridian, 160,000 civilians, mostly agricultural settlers who had come to the planet with seeds and tools, and the quiet hope of building something peaceful on the edge of explored space. A warlord named Gren Vasek had seized the planet with a private army of 4,000 fighters, well-armed, well-supplied, and completely indifferent to civilian life. Vasek was systematically eliminating the population center by center, not for any strategic reason, but because the settlers occupied land he wanted, and removing them was simpler than negotiating. Commonwealth diplomatic intervention had failed. Vasek did not negotiate. Conventional military response was 8 days away. The Sentinel Corps was 2. Cade's unit, the same 12 who would later hold the station at Ashfall, deployed to Meridian with a mandate that the file described in 3 words: stop the killing. They did. In 11 days, operating in hostile terrain against a force that outnumbered them by over 300 to 1, they dismantled Vasek's army piece by piece. Not through overwhelming firepower, because they did not have overwhelming firepower, through the systematic destruction of the army's ability to function as a coherent fighting force. Command nodes identified and eliminated. Supply lines mapped and severed at their most vulnerable points. Communication networks infiltrated and collapsed. Vasek's forces did not surrender in a single dramatic moment. They simply stopped being an army. They fragmented into confused, leaderless groups that could no longer coordinate and no longer understood what they were fighting for, and one by one, they laid down their weapons. 160,000 civilians survived. The settlers of Meridian built a memorial to the 12 operatives who saved them. 12 names carved into native stone, on a world at the edge of explored space, where the wind blows through grass that smells like rain. And then, 4 months later, Ashfall. The station. The siege. The 3 days. 8 of those 12 names became markers on a memorial, instead of people eating dinner and playing music and talking about their dogs. Cade's discharge request was filed the morning after Ashfall. It was granted immediately, with no conditions, no debriefing requirements, no cooling-off period. The final assessment note, which I had already read in the redacted version, appeared here in its full context. Subject shows no signs of diminished capability. Physical and tactical performance metrics remain at the highest levels recorded for any Sentinel Corps operative in the program's history. What the subject shows instead is a profound, unmistakable, and entirely understandable exhaustion with violence itself. Recommend immediate honorable discharge with full benefits and no restrictions on future service, should the subject choose to return. Personal note: I have served with Cade Ashford for 7 years. He is the finest soldier I have ever known, and I hope he never has to be one again. I closed the file and sat with it for a long time. The study was quiet around me. Through the window, the capital was beginning to rebuild, construction drones hovering over the damaged districts like attentive insects. That evening, I asked Cade about Meridian. He did not talk about the operation. He talked about the settlers. How they had built their homes from local timber because they liked the way it smelled when the morning dew warmed on the wood. How the children had organized a school in a converted barn and refused to stop attending classes even during the worst of the fighting, because their teacher, A woman named Elaine Hargreaves told them that learning was not something you stopped doing just because the world got difficult. How the settlers had fed his team from their own dwindling supplies without being asked, leaving baskets of food at the perimeter of the Sentinels' camp each morning, because they believed that the people protecting them should not go hungry. He told me about humans, not the military briefings, not the combat assessments, not the classified dossiers with their careful language and their anxious footnotes. The other thing. The thing underneath. The thing that the intelligence agencies of 6 civilizations had noted in their reports but could not quite explain. Humans were not bred for war. They were not engineered for combat. They were not the product of a warrior culture that glorified strength and conquest, and the taking of trophies. They came from a world where people planted gardens, raised children, wrote poetry that made them cry, fell in love with the reckless abandon of creatures who knew they would die someday, and chose to love anyway, and spent their evenings watching the sunset because they thought the way the light moved through the clouds was beautiful. They were, by every measurable standard, an ordinary species from an ordinary world on an ordinary arm of an ordinary galaxy. And yet, when something threatened the things they loved, when the garden was burning, and the children were in danger, and the sunset was blotted out by smoke, those ordinary people transformed into something that the galaxy had no framework to comprehend. They became precise. They became relentless. They became capable of sustained, focused, controlled violence at a level that made the warrior cultures of the galaxy look like enthusiastic amateurs. And then they stopped. That was the part that no intelligence agency could explain. That was the thing that kept analysts awake at night, writing footnotes full of cautious uncertainty. The humans stopped. They put the weapons down. They went home. They cooked dinner. They asked about your day. They played with their dogs and read books and listened to music, and returned to the ordinary lives they had been living before the violence interrupted them. The capacity did not leave. It waited, folded carefully behind gentle eyes and steady hands, activated only when someone they had chosen to protect was threatened. It was not a switch that turned on and off. It was a depth, a reservoir, and every intelligence analyst who had ever tried to measure it had come to the same conclusion. It was bottomless. I understood now why the military assessments of humanity, from every civilization that had encountered them, all carried that same undercurrent of unease. It was not that humans were the strongest species. They were not. It was not that they were the fastest. They were not that either. It was not that they had the best weapons, or the most advanced technology, or the largest fleet. It was that you could never tell which ones were dangerous. The cultural attaché who cooked breakfast and read books about your history. The administrative assistant who organized filing systems and remembered everyone's birthday. The farmer who grew vegetables and played the violin and talked about her dog. The freckled man with calm gray eyes who looked like he had never been in a fight in his life. Any one of them, under the right circumstances, all of them. That was what frightened the galaxy. Not the capability itself, but its invisibility. Other species built their warriors openly, proudly, obviously. You could see a Sindari champion coming from a mile away. You could identify a Kethrani berserker by the ritual scars on their arms. You could spot a Draveni shock trooper by the augmented musculature that made them twice the width of their natural frame. You could not spot a human. They looked like everyone else. They smiled and laughed and talked about rain and music and the way the light moves through autumn leaves. And somewhere inside every single one of them was the thing that Cade carried, the willingness, the capacity, the quiet, unshakable promise that if you threatened the things they loved, they would rise to meet you with everything they had, and they would not stop until it was over. My father appointed me as the Imperial Liaison to the United Earth Commonwealth, a position that had not existed before, and that he created specifically for the daughter who had proven herself when it mattered. Cade and I would serve together as the bridge between our civilizations. It was a role built on what we had already demonstrated, that the space between species is best crossed not by treaties or threats or displays of military power, but by two people who chose to see each other clearly and refused to look away from what they found. Word of what happened in the Sindari Palace spread across the galaxy with the speed of light and the weight of stone. Other empires reassessed their assumptions about the Commonwealth. Diplomatic requests tripled in the first month. Military alliances were proposed by civilizations that had previously considered humanity too minor to notice. Trade agreements that had languished in bureaucratic limbo for years were suddenly prioritized. The galaxy was adjusting its calculations, and the adjustment was seismic. Earth's representatives handled the attention with the same quiet competence that Cade had shown. They did not boast. They did not threaten. They did not leverage the sudden spike in their galactic reputation to demand concessions or assert dominance. They simply continued to do what they had always done, offering open hands, speaking honestly, and demonstrating capability only when no other option remained. I watched this pattern repeat across a dozen diplomatic encounters, and I realized it was not a strategy. It was not a calculated approach designed by committees in boardrooms and refined through focus groups. It was simply what humans were. They did not want to fight. They did not seek conquest or glory or dominion over others. They wanted to build things and love people and watch the sunset. But if you forced them to fight, if you left them absolutely no other choice, if you threatened the things that mattered to them, then you would discover something that no amount of intelligence analysis could adequately prepare you for. You would discover that the most peaceful people in the galaxy were also the most dangerous. And that contradiction, that impossible, beautiful, terrifying contradiction, was the very heart of what made them human. I stood on the balcony of our quarters on a quiet evening, looking out over the capital as the sun set behind the crystal spires. The city was healing. New construction rose from the damaged districts, clean lines and fresh materials replacing the scars of the assault. The processional boulevards had been repaired and filled again with citizens going about the ordinary business of ordinary lives. It looked, from this height, like a place that had remembered what it was for. Cade stepped out onto the balcony behind me. He moved quietly, the way he always moved, but I heard him. I had learned to hear him. I had learned a lot of things in the months since our wedding, and most of them had been things I never expected to learn, and all of them had changed me in ways I was still discovering. His blade was back in its case, sealed, stored in the closet beside his worn boots and his earth clothing, and the sealed containers of spices he used when he cooked. He had not touched the case since the morning after the crisis. The closet held it the way a sentence holds a word that changes the meaning of everything around it. "Do you think you will ever need it again?" I asked, without turning around. He stood beside me and looked out over the city. The light caught his face, and I saw the lines around his eyes, fine creases that spoke of years spent in places where sleep was a luxury, and sunsets were measured in tactical terms, rather than aesthetic ones. But the eyes themselves were the same, quiet, brown, warm in the way that a fire is warm, steady, and constant, and capable of burning if you forgot what it was. "I hope not," he said. "And if you do?" He turned to look at me. Steady, calm. That impossible gentleness that somehow existed in the same body as everything I now knew he was capable of. A man who had held a station against 900. A man who had saved 160,000 people on a world he had never seen before. A man who had dismantled the finest warriors in my empire, and then sat down and asked me about my day with genuine interest. "The same thing I will always do," he said. "Whatever it takes to make sure you are standing on this balcony tomorrow." I leaned into him. He put his arm around me, and it was the arm that had held the blade, and it was the arm that had cooked me breakfast, and they were the same arm, and that was the entire point. That was what the galaxy could not understand, and what I had only begun to understand myself. The violence and the gentleness were not two different things living in the same body. They were the same thing, expressed in different directions. The fierceness with which Cade protected was identical to the tenderness with which he cared. It came from the same place. It burned with the same fire, and you could not have one without the other, because they were both born from the same impossible, stubborn human refusal to let the things that mattered be destroyed. The city glowed beneath us. The crystal spires caught the last light and scattered it across the sky in patterns that looked like music made visible. Somewhere below, people were going home to their families, carrying the small, sacred weight of ordinary life. Somewhere above, the Imperial fleet held its silent vigil among the stars, crewed by people of a dozen species who were slowly, grudgingly, wonderingly, learning to respect the small, strange species from the small, blue world. And here, on this balcony, in this fading light, the seventh daughter of an empire and the quiet man from Earth stood together and watched the day end, and neither of them needed to say what both of them knew. I had not chosen this marriage. I had not chosen this man. The arrangement had been made by bureaucrats and diplomats who saw us both as minor pieces on a board too large for us to matter. A political footnote, a gesture of goodwill that no one expected to mean anything. They were wrong. About him, about me, about what happens when you put two people together and give them a reason to see each other clearly, about what humans carry inside them, hidden behind their gentle eyes and their steady voices and their stubborn, bewildering insistence on being kind in a galaxy that has given them every reason not to be. I looked at Cade Ashford, at this man who had crossed the stars with a blade he hoped never to draw and a heart that refused to stop caring, and I understood something that every intelligence agency in the known galaxy had been trying to articulate for decades without finding the right words. The most dangerous thing in the universe is not a weapon. It is not a fleet. It is not an empire with 43 star systems and one of the 5 largest navies in existence. The most dangerous thing in the universe is an ordinary person who loves someone and has decided, with the full weight of their quiet, stubborn, terrifying heart, that some things are worth protecting. And humans are full of such people, every single one of them, standing quietly in their ordinary lives, cooking breakfast, reading books, playing with their dogs, watching the sunset, waiting, not because they want to fight, but because they have decided, in that deep and bottomless place where the gentleness and the fierceness are the same thing, that the people they love will not fall. Not today, not tomorrow, not while they are standing. And that is enough. That has always been enough. I held Cade's hand, and the stars came out above us, and for the first time since the marriage was arranged, I felt like I had chosen this. All of it.